the unusual case of Winkie Irvine and his remarkably short sentence took another twist after it was doubled on appeal. What were the reasons, I suppose, that were given for doubling the sentence?
So the sentence that Winston Irvine was given was half of the minimum possible term, with only half of that again to be spent in prison. So the minimum term, he's caught with a load of guns in, I think it was June 2022, in the boot of his car. Another guy, Robin Workman, who is his co-accused, the case was that he had transported the guns from Larne. He then handed them to Winston Irvine, who sticks them in the boot of his car. Police officers then pulls him in and stops him, searches the car, and the guns are found. So originally Winston pleaded not guilty. He tries to imply there was some kind of decommissioning situation going on here. That didn't particularly fly. And then in December last year, last minute, he just pleaded guilty to it. Both of them pleaded guilty. So when it came to the sentencing, he shows up, his defence show up with a folder full of references saying how absolutely amazing Winston is. Winston is the greatest peacekeeper of our time. You know, he is Gandhi, he is Nelson Mandela, he's all of those things. And from the great and the good of civic society, from academics, from clerics, from people who I would have a lot of respect for, who wrote these references for him. So the judge then at the original sentencing, you can have less than the minimum if there are extraordinary circumstances. And the word extraordinary was fired around a lot during that hearing. So 5 years is the minimum for that amount of guns. He gets half the minimum, and then half of that to be spent in prison and half on licence. His co-accused, Robin Workman, who also showed up with references, including one from a former senior RUC officer, he wasn't extraordinary enough. So he gets the whole minimum, the minimum term, half to be spent in jail and half on licence, which is only 2.5 years, by the way, in jail. Winston was only going to do, half of the 2.5 years, a year, whatever, 30 months or whatever it was, in prison. There was an uproar, clearly. I mean, had he been a dissident Republican or anyone else, you'd been looking at serious time for those kind of offences. And a lot of talk of, two-tiered policing and judicial process, which was dealing with him different. In fairness to the police, they had done their job impeccably. It was the court system, I think, that a lot of people had questions about when it came to sentencing. So there was an appeal of that. I think the public prosecution felt obliged almost to appeal it, and that was heard. Dame Siobhan Keegan would be the lead appeal court judge. She's the Lady Chief Justice. And so she then said that it's now double two, but bear in mind, he will now have to do 2.5 years in prison and 2.5 years on licence. That's still the minimum term.
Yeah, it's still a lot.
The weapons that he had. The offence of having weapons is one offence, but what we do have in here in relation to terror legislation is when it comes to sentencing, if it is shown that those weapons were to be used for a terrorist purpose, well then there is, judges then have scope to give more stern sentence and also imply an order. And there's several dissident Republicans subject to these orders at the minute, which means even when you get out of prison, the like of Thomas Eichmann in Derry subject to one of these. He lives in Derry. If he wants to drive 15 minutes across the border to put cheaper petrol in his car, he has to give the police 2 weeks notice of that, because he's not allowed to leave the jurisdiction. If they get a new phone, they have to give him the number. If they want to go on holiday, they have to give the flight number, the hotel number, everything. I mean, it's quite strict to keep an eye, and that's part of that beefed up terrorist legislation. He wasn't charged with that. That wasn't used in this case. They weren't charged with membership of the UVF. They only had the bare minimum in terms of the PPS charges. The reason why the appeal court said that they had, his defence clearly argued again, this was justified, that his peace work and his contribution to peace and charity work meant that he was an exceptional person who was entitled to less than the minimum sentence. But the prosecution said there was no exceptional circumstances, and said basically what people like myself have been saying from the start of this. The peace work that he was involved in, which was paid, by the way, he wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He was getting very well paid for it from government funding. The Irish government had paid for him to do his master's degree in Maynooth. All of that was funded through different peace organisations. That's actually not a mitigating factor, it's an aggravating factor, because he was pulling the wool over people's eyes.
I mean, it's an act of cynicism to on one hand, live off the proceeds of the peace process, and on the other hand, at the very least, be transporting weapons.
I mean, he would have had those, had he not been stopped by police and he'd went and put those weapons wherever they were going to put, that afternoon, he would have quite happily went and had meetings with the police about, some project that was taking place. In fact, while he was on bail, he was still working the entire time in public-funded peace-building roles. He organised a conference in a hotel that was to do with like band culture and things like that. It was called Belfast Cultural Network, who were employing him. And 2 cops showed up to that event. And there's a video of, Winkie standing on the stage, thanking everyone that came, including the PSNI who are here today. Now, can you imagine in any other jurisdiction, in any other planet, in any other world, had he been, say, a dissident Republican, had he been a criminal, had that been someone who was part of an organised crime group in the South, can you imagine, first of all, that they'd still be getting paid public money to organise peace events and cultural events? And can you imagine 2 police officers showing up and sitting there and clapping and, this is all great work?
Totally,
it's nuts.
Yeah, it is nuts because, and obviously the peace process has delivered so much for the North, so it's not to put down on that, but that distinction between, where do terror organisations stop and where does normal society begin? Like, it has sort of, this case has brought that into stark relief, hasn't it? Because, like, obviously...
It's what journalists were saying for a long time. We were saying, look, there are people involved in the peace process who were former paramilitaries, and they do amazing work within their own communities. And there are loyalist paramilitaries who have completely and utterly transitioned into civilian life. And they either, go away, they have a job, they own their own business, they, go on holiday with their family, or they still work in the community sector as part of that peace building world. But they have completely and utterly embraced the peace process. But Winston Irvine was a commander of the UVF while still at an organisation that was still involved in extortion and racketeering, that was still involved in recruiting young men into the UVF.
And that's not just a journalist's opinion, that's the opinion of the state. With the state continued, the PSNI and all other bodies of the state put out reports every year saying the UVF are involved in drug dealing, involved in extortion, involved in threats, involved in all of this. Like, it's not just a sort of an opinion from somebody randomly in the community. I mean, this is the state's opinion, yet, the police are also coming and cheering them at events,
Yeah, well, B Company of the UVF were involved. If you cast your mind back a few years ago when Simon Coveney was given a talk in, of all places, in the Hoban Centre as part of the John and Pat Hume Peace Foundation, and the B Company of the UVF abducted a guy who life was practically ruined by this, put what looked like a real bomb. I mean, as far as the driver, I think he was a plumber of that car, was concerned, there was a bomb in the back of his van. He was told to drive it up to the centre in Ardoyne where that was taking place. The guy drives into the car park, falls out of the car, falls on the ground in hysterics. He had to be helped away. There's those images you see of the security coming over and whispering in Coveney's ear and getting him to hell out of there because they believed it was a real bomb. I mean, that made, because that was linked to the Brexit negotiations, that made headlines beyond these shores, and the fact then, it was quite obvious that the UVF were far from dormant. They weren't still on ceasefire. They were intimidating an Irish minister trying to give a talk on peace. And that was the same unit that Winkie was a commander of. And yet, at the same time, he would have then, 2 days later, been sitting in a meeting talking about, the thing that really gets me too is, that some of the things that they would be involved in, it's laziness on behalf of the NIO, because rather than go into a working class loyalist community and go, look, what is really needed here? And a lot of things are needed. And a lot of that would be to do with empowering young people and making sure that there's, educational achievement. And if not, if there's apprenticeships, there's a way forward, there's a life, there's something that's going to give them hope. It's looking after those women's groups. It's making sure that mental health, drugs, addiction, all of those things are dealt with. And instead of actually going into those communities and finding someone who's best placed or bringing someone from the outside who might have worked in education to work with young people, they instead give the funding to a UVF or UDA link group and then say to them, you facilitate this, because the way that Winkie run that peace building work in the Shankill is nothing here without us.
Yeah.
You will not get in here. I am the gatekeeper and you will not get access without me.
Exactly. And it's so unusual. Like, I mean, because obviously I work with the Sunday World North edition and, coming to it, from a totally different angle. But then I remember we were doing stories about people getting intimidated out of their house. And then one of the reporters up there telling me, oh yeah, well, the PSNI checked with the UDA and it is a real threat. So they did take them out. And I'm going, What do you mean they checked with the UDA if it's a real threat? So they're like, they're these things that aren't, it's not normal. Basically.
If you control housing, you control everything. I always think that, especially social housing. So if you have paramilitary groups manipulating the housing system and the housing points, well, that means if you build a brand new build of new houses, and people who have been waiting years with their children, maybe living in a 1 or 2 bedroom flat on a family, a forever home, and you're on the list for that, if they can manipulate the housing list, and that's what they were doing in cases. Now, there's been changes to that system to try and stop that. But for instance, coming up the time when they knew those houses were going to be allocated, they didn't just start sending their girlfriend or partner threats. Then the PSNN, the House Executive, go to a place called Base 2. Base 2 goes to a restorative justice group, which is linked to the UVF or UDA, and go, is this threat real? And they go, yeah, it is real. Then they go back and say, yeah, that threat's real. Then that person goes to the top of the housing list. Then they get that house. Well, then if you have, all of your family members and supporters all getting those new houses, that estate becomes yours. You then control that estate, which means if you're involved in any illegal activity and coming and going, there's no one in that estate's going to ring the cops on you, because they're all linked to you. And the few that aren't are so terrified because everybody else is, that they'll keep their heads down and say nothing. So you control housing, you control everything.
It's incredible. And the state would get the okay. I mean, it's just bizarre. Now, there's no doubt, it's not just you saying this, there's other people in society now starting to say, however many years into the peace process, you can understand as you transition out of the troubles that you had these big organisations, highly armed, and there did need to be a period of time where there might have been a grey area, and, that everybody accepted that. Some people very reluctantly, some people embraced it, but it's understandable. But when does that end, and how does it end? And is there a desire for it to end in society now?
The way that it was being run, there was no incentive for it to end, because it was all carrot, no stick. Do you know what I mean? So there was constantly funded projects about loyalist transition and paramilitary transition. Well, think about that logically. If you're being funded in a project about transitioning, why would you end? Because the end game ends the money, it ends the access to government, it ends everything. So why would you end it? There was just last month, at the end of last month, the end of September, there was an interlocutor who was appointed by both the British and Irish governments. That was part of a recommendation by the Independent Reporting Commission, who said, look, can we get someone independent to do what they call a scoping exercise? Give it a year, give it 12 months. Let them go and speak to all of those representatives of those paramilitary groups and to the police and to members of civic society and all sorts of other things, and compile a report to say, is this possible? What could actually be achieved? And there are people who probably could be brought along, and that'll include talking to dissident Republicans as well, groups on ceasefire, not on ceasefire, and what is actually going to be achieved by that. Now, some people are not in favour of that. The Alliance Party and the Justice Minister have said, this is nonsense, you're just pandering to these people, enough is enough, that's it, they've had their transits done. I suppose I take a different point of view. I think we've thrown that much money at it unsuccessfully. What is another year? Let the person go in, let them do their job, let them do the scoping exercise. And honestly, at the end of it, if they say, no, this isn't possible, well then the funding to all that nonsense has to stop. It becomes a policing issue. And anyone who genuinely does want to walk away, they go. Now, the paramilitaries are being quite crafty in terms of how they're dealing with this. So recently we've obviously had the far right. You have the same thing going on yourselves in the south. The far right here tends to be more loyalist. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but it tends to be more around loyalist communities. So you have those vigilante groups that are popping up all over the place, patrolling the streets, stopping anyone who looks foreign, demanding to see their papers like some sort of Stasi, asking them where they're going, stopping children in parks, migrant children. On one occasion, there's a homeless man is beaten up and his sleeping bags thrown into the leg, and they're just absolute thugs. And most of them, as is the case everywhere, most of them have convictions. One of them, obviously, I had reported not long ago, had a conviction for stabbing a 14-year-old. Another one is a well-known bank robber. They're also then are citizen journalists as well, as you know. So they've all got a selfie stick and a microphone, and they're running around and running amok. Now, people keep saying they must be linked to the UVF, the UDA, or they wouldn't be getting away with what they're doing. And then the UVF and the UDA are going, well, they're not linked to us.
Yeah.
But we're not telling them to stop because you just want us to go away.
Yeah.
So if we go away, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
This is who's going to replace us. Chaos is going to ensue. So you can't have it both ways. Do you want us to get rid of them and threaten them and tell them to stop doing it? or do you want us to ignore them and you can see what happens when we're not here? So there's a bit of that going on at the minute. And I think there's a bit of chess playing in terms of, what we'll do and what we won't do, what we're willing to do, what we can do and what we can't do. And it is true, if you take away one organisation in the morning, a load of young people will just adopt the name and people hear more hardline because there's money to be made in it.
Yeah.
Organised crime the world over makes money. The only difference between organised crime in Dublin or Manchester or Leeds or, Glasgow is that here it has a paramilitary element to it. But let's face it is just still organised crime. It just has a military type structure in the names that the people are given here at the top of that. But it is just an organised crime gang at this stage, and that's all it really is. Now, there are older people involved in it who would have nothing to do with criminality and who show up in Remembrance Day and lay a wreath and go about their business and consider themselves very much loyalist and very much of the past of that organisation. But the structure of that organisation exists to keep people safe from other criminal gangs. If you are in the UDA and you have a fight with someone in the UVF, you can't just go around to their house, and knock some spells out of them. You have to then go to the leadership of that organisation. They have a problem with this person. So there's protection in it as well.
Yeah, but ultimately, you get to the point where whatever transitioning can be done, it has to reach an end point, surely, where there is nobody left to transition but the criminal. But the
I think that we probably reached that quite some time ago. There's an argument that they say is, well, look, we'd like to retain the name because if we don't, someone else is just going to take it and use it for criminality. But if we retain the name and it's prescribed, so therefore it's not illegal, then we'll just use it for remembrance events, like an old boys society. They'll come out once a year and they'll march around in circles and they'll air and they'll all go home. And some people would go, no, even that is too much. That shouldn't be allowed either. But I do think that you could probably bring at this stage. I remember speaking to someone from the IRC and they said, look, we reckon we could bring more than half, potentially even 3/4 of their current membership along with us on the road to peace. But there is going to be a hardcore rump who are just going to go, no, because this suits our lifestyle. It suits the way we live and we're not giving this up.
No.
And that then just has to become a criminal matter for the police to deal with. But that doesn't mean the police phoning that boy up and asking them, has someone been threatened out of their house, or they'll have to go or do they not have to go. It doesn't mean them starting whispering in the rear, if there's trouble or at the interface and asking them for help, because all of that just normalised those people's existence.
It did, and it gave them a reason to exist. Will Winkie now, when he comes out of prison in the slightly longer future, is he going to be welcomed back into the arms of loyalism, or is his reputation damaged by the whole thing?
There's conflicting reports on that. I've been told that he's done within the UVF, but not in a way where he is under threat or he's going to have to leave. I've been told he's in the loyalist wing of the prison, so that tells you all you need to know. So he's very much part of that loyalist separated wing within Magabry. You call that Bush House, where the loyalists are housed away from the other prisoners. He will go home to Ballysillan, where he lives, beside the Shankill. But they're saying he won't be involved in them, and also he won't be allowed to step back in and take that role, as he would have been the person dealing with the interlocutor. So they've appointed this interlocutor. It's a woman who's been appointed to that role. Winkie would have been at all the meetings for her, telling her what was happening, what wasn't happening. So they're saying he'll not be involved in that again. But all of that's dependent on the UVF still has the same leadership in place that it had way back in the 80s and 90s. So you can imagine the age of those people. They're of a certain vintage and they're not going to be around forever. And he does still have some allies within that organisation who maybe if that older leadership were to, disappear, die, basically. I mean, there are people in their 70s, some of them heading up towards their 80s. Would he be able to step back into there again? I did hear that there was a community event and that one person who is one of the people who would have been singing his praises when he was out did say, I haven't given up hope. I think there's a path back for him yet. And I'm like, what do you actually need to do in this place? A boot full of guns, and then still they're saying, but there's hope for him yet. We'll find a path back for him.
It's like journalists, we never fully go away, do we?
I really hope that when I do go away, you never hear from me again. I hope to one day retire to Spain and have a nice peaceful life and never take anything more to do with journalism is my plan.
Well, if that day comes, we won't phone you for Crime World. Thanks, Alison.